Thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's very difficult to follow after your inspirational talk. It's really amazing. And of course, Dr. Jimenez, who has shaped the field of pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas and developing better therapies for, for this patient population, which is an unmet need. And, Dr. Jimenez was here is an inspiration as well for many of us. So thank you. Thank you for that. And it's true. I always tell my patients are like my kids and they do misbehave because sometimes when I call them, they don't call me back. So, so that's for sure. But anyway, that's true. Where do I go? Okay, so I was given the job to talk about clinical trials, what clinical trials means to patients, what they are, and how it's important as well. Because by doing clinical trials, we can then develop better therapies for patients with pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas, as well as all the rare cancer, which is certainly an unmet need. So what are clinical trials? So clinical trials are research studies that help us to understand and find better ways to prevent, screen, diagnose, and as well as treat the disease. Clinical trials may also compare new therapies with other therapies that has been used for the specific disease or tumor that we're treating. And the goal of clinical trials is to be able to determine different treatment approaches as well as to understand how effective they are and how safe they are. So in terms of the clinical trials, there are different phases of clinical trials. So I imagine, I don't know if any of you has participated in clinical trials, but there are different phases of clinical trials. So phase 1 clinical trials, that means that that study will involve a small number of patients. But the goal of phase 1, especially when we're talking about a treatment, is to understand safety and to also understand what is the maximum dose that the patient can tolerate. That's the goal of the phase 1 study. The phase 2 study is a larger cohort of patients. Once we understand what is the best dose that the patient can receive, then the phase 2 is to understand how effective the specific drug can be on patients on a specific disease or cancer type. Like I say, phase 2 is encompass a larger cohort of patients, and the idea is to understand, what is the true efficacy of the drug. Once the study goes from phase 2 to phase 3, usually phase 3 is to compare as well. As I said earlier, the clinical trials is also to understand new therapies and compare with other therapies. So that's usually phase 3 as well. They can help us compare how well the therapies work or whether one therapy could be better than other, but also it's a longer term follow-up as well. And it's also help us understand better what is the safety as well as to understand the long-term efficacy of the drug. Once we understand that, so then if there's all this information is then submitted to the FDA can certainly decide about the approval of the drug before it can then go to phase 4, which phase 4 is to understand long-term side effects, long-term complications, surveillance after the drug has been approved. In certain situations when the drug can be effective, especially with rare cancers, it's possible that the treatment can be approved after a phase 2, and that's the example that we have with Dr. Jimenez's study with besultifan. So besultifan showed early efficacies and extra efficacy early on, and because pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas is an unmet need, it was approved after it showed that the treatment was indeed efficacious, which is certainly is a big win for the community. And that's why, I always say, Dr. Jimenez, we thank you for that work that you put for years as well. So in terms of the clinical trials, so whenever a patient is enrolled on clinical trials, we understand we need to answer certain questions. What is the primary question that we want to answer when a patient is enrolled in a clinical trial? So, and that's why whenever sometimes you go see the doctor give you consent of the clinical study, and they usually provide information about what the drug is and what is the goal of the study. Usually, the most important question to answer is whether, we need to understand if the drug can shrink tumors, if the drug can stabilize a tumor. And that's usually what we call our primary objective. So the most important question that we want to answer. And then the secondary objectives is other questions that we wanted to understand by giving the drug, whether this can also improve the quality of life of our patients, whether they can prolong in terms of overall, what we call overall survival, how long the patient can live with the disease. So that's the different questions that we want to answer by doing these studies. So natural history studies is important as well, because especially for rare cancers, we also need to understand what is the long-term biology and of these tumors. And sometimes natural history study help us understand more about how these tumors behave, help us understand what therapies may be effective by studying in details about the specific disease or tumor type. And that's why natural history study is important. Because it also helps us understand what will be the important questions that we need to answer for that specific tumor type. It helps us understand also about any certain clues to prevent cancer as well as to develop therapies. And that's the reason why the NIH is one of the institutions that help us to develop natural history studies. And as Gina was saying, is one of the studies that we're grateful that she's part of, because that will also help us understand long-term and help patients as well. Not only the patients that are on the studies, but the idea is to be able to help other patients in need by being able to understand about the natural histories of their disease, and also understand what treatment works, what interventions may be needed, if there is any specific commonalities between patients that help us understand that this is what we need to target, and so forth. So in terms of clinical trials for Pheochromocytomas and Paragangliomas, there have been a few of them. There are a few of them that has been ongoing. There have been a few of them that has stopped approval and still waiting for the information. But I think it's important for you to know what is upcoming. And one of the studies I would like to mention that I'm very proud to be part of with Dr. Perez from Dana-Farber is a chemotherapy option. So we know that in patients that have as Dr. Jimenez discussed earlier about what is the efficacy of chemotherapy, the chemotherapy that has been used is an IV form of chemotherapy. So temozolomide is an oral form of chemotherapy that we know has been given in patients. But we wanted to understand whether we can make this chemotherapy more effective. So, and that's why we combine it with another drug that is called olaparib. And what we know is that temozolomide is a type of medication that breaks the DNA of the tumor. And what your own DNA is going to try to do is going to try to repair that DNA. And when that happens, sometimes the drug stops working. So if we add olaparib, the idea could be stop that DNA repair, and we can make the therapy more effective. So that's one of the questions that we wanted to answer by doing that study. And this study is what we call a randomized study. So both cohort patients receive the drug, and we is either receiving the temozolomide alone or temozolomide in combination with this drug called olaparib. That what it's going to do is trying to block that repair that we discussed about. So now let's discuss a little bit theranostics. I'm sure you heard a little bit about theranostics earlier today, so I may not go into detail. And I wanted to mention Dr. Ling is here, who is a PI on some of the studies that we're going to discuss about. But so theranostic is a combination of treatment and diagnostics. And maybe Dr. Ling can answer more in detail that if you want to ask some questions. But theranostic is that we have, the pheochromocytoma has a specific receptor in the surface of the cancer cell, and that's called the somatostatin receptor. So if you are able to localize that receptors, and then you give a type of radiation, so that either via imaging studies or via therapy, what it's going to do is that type of agent is going to bind to the receptor. And that's why if you look at the picture, you have the PO cell, it has a receptor, there's some certain receptors. Then I give the drug either for diagnostic or for treatment, and it's going to go to the receptors. And once it binds to the receptor, that is, you go inside the cancer cells and has the killing effects. So, and we know that pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas they're known to express that receptor, and based on that information, currently we have the type of what we call PRRT, we call a peptide receptor radionuclide therapy. I'm sorry, it's a really long name, but that's a type of treatment or radiation treatment that we target those receptors. And there are two types of them. One of them is the beta receptor, which is called Lutathera, and the other one that is in studies and phase 1 study is the alpha receptor. And what it means, and I'm sorry that maybe I'm talking a little bit in terms of more complex definition, but the alpha receptor is supposed to be more specific to the cancer cells. I mean, as we can see, there is different examples, but all the pictures you can see, but the alpha receptor is going to be more directly to the cancer cells, less collateral damage, but still, we need to understand the full efficacy. Maybe there may be a question whether it can also target larger tumor because of that. So that's something that, the investigators is trying to understand. But at the NIH, we do have a phase 2 study of Lutathera. Dr. Lin is the PI of the study. Lutathera has been approved for patients with neuroendocrine tumors of the GI as well as pancreas. This study is available at the NIH, is still ongoing. And we're learning too that what this drug do, it also stabilize the growth of tumors. What we're trying to understand is whether based on mutations, because you learn also that patients with pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas, they also have different mutations. But Dr. Lin is trying to understand whether having different mutations may have different efficacy. And that's something that we need to understand and is continually, and we're still enrolling patients for that. As I say, this is another type of radioligand therapy. This is the alpha PRRT, and then this is also Dr. Lim also have these available. And there's two types of alpha PRRT. One is for those patients that have not received Lutathera, so we call that Lutathera naive. And there is another alpha PRRT for patients that already has received Lutathera. And that's still ongoing. Since this is a still early phase, remember that the phase 1 is to determine the best dose that the patient can tolerate, and because it's still early on, so Dr. Lim has a study that is a phase 1. Once we know what is the best dose that the patient can tolerate, then it's then going to move to the phase 2. And for, as you can see, the tumors that is included is for those tumors that we know express somatostatin receptor, so as the GI neuroendocrine tumors, as well as pheochromocytomas and other tumor types. And this is the one that I just discussed was for those patients that are that has received prior PRT, and this is the one that they are PRT naive, and as well we're trying to understand what is the phase 1 to understand what is the best that the patient can tolerate, and then move to the phase 2 and understand what is the efficacy by giving this drug. Dr. Foco, this is also a Pheochromocytoma Paraganglioma expert. He worked with him in the study. Dr. Pasak also worked with him on the study. This is lanreotide. So lanreotide is an injection that is given once a month. And lanreotide also binds to somatostatin receptor, but in a different way. So because the ones that we discussed with the radioligand, so it's a different way of treatment, it's a type of radiation. This one is an injection. It has its own character in a way, but it also binds to somatostatin receptor, and that's injection that is given once a month. The study closed for accrual. We're still analyzing the data, but we feel that just preliminary data that by giving these injections, it can certainly slow down growth of tumors, but we need to understand which patients may benefit from each therapy, because there are therapies out there, but the treatment of these tumors is very specific to patient to patient. And I always say it's not like one size fits all. So depending on what we see on the scans, depending on how we see our patients, whether it's localized but cannot have surgery, whether it's in the liver, whether it expresses a somatostatin receptor, whether it's more slow growing or rapidly growing. It helps us also understand what therapies the patients may benefit from, and that's also important to know. So the other one is a study that is just close for approval, but I think it's important to mention is axitinib. And what is axitinib? Axitinib is a oral medication. It's within the family that we call the tyrosine kinase inhibitors. And basically what this drug does is blocks the blood vessel supply going into the tumor. It binds to specific proteins and may cut in the blood supply. There are a few of them. One of them is axitinib, and we are analyzing the data from this one, but so this tyrosine kinase, we feel that this can also help shrink tumors as well, and also stabilize tumors. But it's also very similar to other studies that has been done. And I have to mention, this is a study that Dr. Jimenez discussed earlier. It's called the cabozantinib. And cabozantinib is also within the family of the tyrosine kinase inhibitors. And just a little bit, I know this may be a little bit more complex, more scientific, but in medicine and clinical trials, we call this a waterfall plot. And basically what it is, each line represents one patient. And the more the numbers that we see here is the more the decrease in the size of the tumor. So and thus, as you can see here, we have some information with axitinib, we have information with cabozantinib, and we see that this can certainly shrink tumors. And also, it also helps stabilize tumors as well. So that's the information that we have with this. And like I said, Dr. Jimenez discussed this earlier. So, and I think you may have heard about Vesultipan. So Vesultipan, like I said, Dr. Jimenez also was the lead investigator on this study. What we know about Pheochromocytomas Paragangliomas is it has a very specific protein, and Dr. Patsa knows a lot about HIF2 because he's the one that also described and discovered the HIF2 in patients with Pheochromocytomas Paraganglioma. So we know is present in patients with pheochromocytoma. What this protein do is kind of like cause a state of low oxygen. And when that low oxygen happens, that kind of promote cell growth and proliferation. And there is a medication that blocks that. This medication was recently approved by the FDA. That was in May 2025. We still don't know all the data. We still don't know whether patients that have the mutations may do better than others, so it will be the same. That's something that Dr. Jimenez will present soon. But what we know is it was approved by the FDA and was based on the response. So we learned that it can shrink tumors. We also know that the patients that receive the drug by shrinking tumors also reduce the hypertensive medications as well. And we know also to stabilize the tumors for a longer period of time. So because of that information, we know that this medication is effective for patients with pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas. The FDA granted approval, and that's certainly a big step for this for our community, and we're very happy about that. So this is just some information. When the company originally developed the study, they kind of have different arms, so different cohorts. So the ones that are still open is the ones that are HIF2 alpha. We know that a very small subset of patients may have HIF2 alpha mutation, and that's still available and open. And there is another tumor type, which is called GIST, and patients that have mutations, they can also develop this tumor type as well, and that's still ongoing. So lastly, I'm just going to talk about one of the studies that we have at the NIH. So this is a antibody, we call that an antibody drug conjugated, which is a type of immunotherapy. So in this, and basically this antibody drug conjugated, the way I describe to patients is like has 3 different parts. So the cancer cells express a protein. There is antibody that targets that protein, but it doesn't go immediately inside the cells. So in order to help to get that antibody to go inside the cells in order to do the killing effect, then it's linked to another molecule, which is usually chemotherapy based, and all these 3 parts together, they go inside the cancer cells and then has a killing effect. So we know that pheochromocytomas, as we can see, is this one, and other adrenal tumors has the highest expression of this protein of DLP1. And because of that, we were able to talk to our company, and we were able to have the first in human. So this is phase 1. So the idea is to be able to understand what is the best dose that the patient can tolerate. Right now, we are in dose level 6, so that's why it's a little bit darker. So meaning that we have already tried different doses. We have seen that the patient is able to tolerate the doses quite well. So we see now with the new cohort patients what this dose would do, but this is a new target. This is something that is novel, and really we want to know what will be the effect in patients that have adrenal tumors. So this is all the active study that's going. As you can see, I went to what we call is a clinicaltrial.gov, and I just tried to see how many calls are available for POs and paras, and I was actually able to fit in one slide. So I think we need to do better. We need to do more treatments. But I know that this is an ongoing work, and I'm happy to be working with such amazing scientists that wanted to make a difference in this disease. I know I'm running out of time. I believe you have these slides that I want you to have, but whenever you has an interest in clinical trials and want to talk about clinical trials, it's important that you know what questions to ask. I always tell patients knowledge is power. So whenever you need to understand what you are dealing with, what is the goal, what are the questions that you need to ask, why this therapy versus other therapies that are available. So that's an important question that you need to ask your doctor, and also understand the risks and benefits too. Why in terms of side effects, and why my doctor is choosing this one versus others. I think that's important. And this is other questions about your rights, about how your health information is kept private. Talk about costs. We know that patients with rare cancer, sometimes they have to travel long distance in terms of get therapies. And we need to understand that, and we need to understand how we can help patients to decrease the financial burden that even with the studies, and even if our patient is involved in clinical studies, and also about your daily life, and how is this going to affect your day-to-day activities. I think these are important questions, and I definitely provide this information to you. And there is how to participate in clinical studies at the NIH. So this is information as well. There's always a direct contact information. There's others, Dr. Jimenez and others have also clinical studies as well. But I think it's important to also obtain information on how you can participate on them and all the questions that we just discussed. I feel like this website is important and it's easy sometimes for patients, more than clinicaltrials.gov. Sometimes when you go to clinicaltrials.gov, it's very complex to navigate, especially for patients. I do feel that this website, either you call, or you can just do a live help, or you can just email. They provide a lot of information about the clinical studies. And with that, I just want to thank everyone. So I think I would like to acknowledge, my mentors and the people I work with very closely. And I always say this cancer cannot cripple love, cannot shatter hope, and it cannot conquer the spirit. And with that, I just want to thank you all for your attention.